Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the agricultural fields surrounding Cody, Wyoming. When you think of grizzly bear attacks, a cornfield isn't the first background that comes to mind. But this area isn't just farm fields. The Shoshone National Forest surrounds it and is only about 30 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. The land between the park and the farmland is remote and rugged mountains with uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees along the ridges. The Shoshone National Forest is on the eastern slope of the Great Divide, and all the waters that fill the creeks head toward the Mississippi River. Down in the valleys, willows and berry bushes screen the creek banks for the animals that live there. Moose, mule deer, elk, and antelope are common sights here. Black bears, bobcats, cougars, grizzly bears, and wolves stalk the trails while they raise the next generation of predators. Although the ridges and hillsides may be as wild as they've ever been, the agricultural areas in the valleys are dotted with ranches and farms. The water that feeds the creeks and streams is often diverted to water the corn, wheat, and alfalfa that grows here. It may be too remote for most people, but the hardy people of western Wyoming wouldn't live anywhere else. This lifestyle demands hard work, which shapes and conditions the people who work the land. On Thursday, June 20th, 2013, 65-year-old Nick Patrick had beaten the sun out of bed and was headed toward his fields. The creek beds around Nick's fields were crowded with brush and smaller trees that hid pheasants, grouse, and deer. They were all common sights in the early morning hours and were always a pleasant surprise for Nick. Nick was a big supporter of the protection of grizzly bears in Wyoming. He served on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Board, which strives to preserve vital habitats, create travel corridors for wildlife, and connect human allies to support these resources. Nick had even hosted board meetings at his ranch in recent years. This week, Nick had a handful of special visitors to his ranch. His oldest daughter had brought her 4 children to visit Grandpa on the ranch, but Nick didn't let that pull him away from his work. He would complete the day's work, then visit with them afterward, catching up on all the fun events that had transpired in their lives. As Nick worked his way along the ditch bank, his dog began to bark incessantly a short distance away. Raccoons were common in the area, and Nick assumed the dog had run into another one. He picked up his shovel and headed toward the gully, located about 50 yards from where he was working in the field. Just as Nick began to walk down into the gully, he could see his dog. It was barking toward the brush along the creek, but what he was barking at wasn't very clear. Before Nick could gain control of the dog, a huge sow grizzly stormed from the brush, followed closely by her 2 cubs. Grizzly bears are not an uncommon sight around Cody, especially on the hills above Nick's fields. They can be seen grazing their way across green meadows from the roads in springtime. Once in a while, a problem will arise with a bear killing livestock or raiding grain supplies, but generally they keep to themselves. They tend to avoid anything affiliated with humans as much as possible. Once the sow set her eyes on Nick, there wasn't much taking her attention away from him. She quickly covered the ground between them at a rate that didn't afford Nick any time to think, let alone react. He could see her massive shoulder muscles ripple with each stride as she streaked toward him. It was clear by her immense size that Nick could not fight her, and he knew good and well there was no sense in trying to outrun her. Nick had only one weapon at his side, his trusty shovel. He picked it up like a baseball bat and did his best impression of Babe Ruth upside the grizzly's head. As the shovel smacked against the sow's skull, Nick soon realized the noise it made was the worst part. The grizzly wasn't bothered by the blow from the shovel and didn't slow down in her progress toward him. Given he had put all of his energy into swinging the shovel, Nick was briefly left in a twisted posture. Both of his arms were holding the shovel, which was now to his left and behind him. This pose left his face pointed toward the bear, with nothing to protect it. The angry sow used the awkward position Nick's shovel swing had left him in, and clamped her jaws around his entire face. Her canines sank in from cheekbone to cheekbone, and when she closed her jaws, she peeled off the skin between them, including Nick's nose. The cracking and popping of his cheekbones drowned out all the other noise Nick could hear. The sow pulled the mouthful of Nick's face away, while pressing his shoulders with her paws. As the sow loosened her grip on Nick's face, she slid her jaws down his body to his left knee. Clamping her jaws onto it, she dragged him about 20 feet, puncturing and tearing flesh as she did so. Now missing most of the middle part of his face and fearing the sow was going to continue her attack, Nick flipped onto his stomach. Playing dead must have seemed like the best option, as resistance was clearly futile. He was hoping that he could cover up any vulnerable parts of himself that she hadn't yet bit into, but for some reason the sow suddenly changed her mind. It may have been thoughts of her cubs, or perhaps she felt Nick was no longer a danger. Either way, the sow disappeared into the brush as Nick lay on his stomach. As he lifted his head from the soil, Nick could feel his upper lip flopping against his chin. He knew this grizzly had done some terrifying damage to his face, so he reached into his pocket in search of his cell phone. He pulled the phone out and quickly dialed 911, hoping to find a calming professional on the other end. Unfortunately for Nick, the gully he was in was without reception, and no one answered his call for help. Upon seeing him moving, the grizzly sow bounded back in Nick's direction. She must have figured he was dead when she left, and was a bit angered to see he wasn't. This time she bit onto the back of his head and chewed up his scalp real good. Like the unwilling participant in some kind of sadistic game, Nick jerked and screamed each time the sow bit into a different area than she had previously. The pressure from her jaws was the most overwhelming sensation. Nick had never felt such pain before in his life, and felt the bear's canines piercing his flesh and slamming against his bones, with crunches that resonated through his body. Her claws and teeth punched quick holes and gashes through Nick's vest and back before she dashed back into the brush. As soon as she left him, Nick peeked up the gully to see her gather her cubs and leave. He continued to watch the bears as they disappeared from sight, hoping that she would not return for a third round. Nick pulled himself together and began assessing his wounds, at least those that he could see. His most devastating injury was clearly out of his view, but he could feel the middle part of his face was missing. It may have been the adrenaline, but Nick knew he had to get to medical help as quickly as possible. There was no one walking along that gully any time soon, in all likelihood, and Nick couldn't afford to wait for help. He slowly worked his way to his feet and staggered toward his home, which was a few hundred yards away. After reaching his home, he stumbled his way back to his shop. Nick knew his grandkids would run outside to see him as soon as he arrived, and he knew that the damage the sow had inflicted on his face would terrify them. He immediately stumbled into his workshop in search of a towel, trailing blood behind him. Wiping the blood and other bodily fluids from his face, Nick eventually found the towel he was looking for and draped it over his head. Then he staggered toward the house to ask them to call for medical help. When first responders arrived, they loaded Nick into the ambulance and rushed him toward West Park Hospital in Cody. As soon as he arrived, the medical staff there recognized that his wounds were far too severe for treatment from their facility. They arranged for a medical helicopter to transport Nick to the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He was stabilized there and remained in the intensive care unit while a ventilator helped him breathe. The middle of Nick's face, including his nose and all the skin between his cheekbones, had completely been removed. The risk of infection was immediately identified, given the injuries to his sinuses only a few inches from his brain. Wyoming Game and Fish officers began an investigation into the cause and circumstances of Nick's grizzly bear attack. They set out culvert traps along the gullies and fields in the area, hoping to catch the bears before any further incidents could occur. If they caught the sow, they could check her for a lip tattoo or an ear tag to gauge whether she had been a problem bear or if this was simply an isolated incident. They were not considering euthanizing the sow without knowing her background, if there was one at all. The wardens found the sow's tracks and followed them away from the agricultural areas in the valley. The bears had departed for more remote areas away from people. Given she would not likely encounter any more people in the location she had ended up at, they decided to stop tracking her, for now. Wardens decided the grizzly sow had reacted to a perceived threat to herself and her cubs. As severe as it was, the attack was deemed a defensive attack. Nick's dog ended up with a long gash down his back, but recovered from his run-in with the grizzly. Nick's efforts had likely saved his dog's life, but nearly cost him his own. As Nick slowly recovered in the ICU, his friends sent prayers and messages of support. They noted that being in good physical condition probably contributed to him surviving the severe mauling. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the sow have left after the initial attack if he had played dead? Did the presence of the dog add an aggravating circumstance for the grizzly? Do you think this sow should be pursued and killed after such a brutal mauling? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Granite Creek, which flows just northwest of Mount Eielson in Denali National Park, Alaska. The creek bed is thick with alder and willow bushes, limiting visibility to a very short distance. In the valley bottoms, the land is flat but quickly slopes upward, with each peak in the area rising over 5,000 feet in elevation. The jagged peaks here are alpine, which leaves them barren of trees. Dull sheep somehow eke out a living in this cold and bleak environment. In the plants along the creeks, moose, caribou, and marmot seek shelter from the elements. Hiding from wolverines, wolves, lynx, black bears, and brown bears isn't an easy task, but somehow they manage. In Denali National Park, roads provide access to trailheads which lead to panoramic views that few human feet had trod. This area is in nearly the same condition as it had been for thousands of years. Many of the animals here seldom, if ever, see human beings, let alone feel a substantial impact from their presence. Hiroshi Tokura was a 25-year-old man on August 11, 1980. He and 3 of his friends were hiking through the park, taking breathtaking photos and otherwise enjoying each other's company and the beauty of the park. As the hikers approached the edge of Granite Creek, the bushes grew thick and tall. The babbling of the creek plays its own peaceful tune as occasional breezes wave through the treetops. The hikers were immersed in the scents, sounds, and sights of Mother Nature's art gallery. Hiroshi was leading the hiking group as they navigated the trail through the brush. As he pushed the willow limbs out of his way, he heard a strange sound only a few yards in front of him. The sound reminded him of a large dog's bark, but resonated in deeper, longer tones. Hiroshi knew that moose and caribou didn't make this sound, but was worried that he might find out what animal does. As soon as he glanced around a willow bush, an enormous brown bear came into view. The bear had already been alerted to the hiker's presence, as evidenced by its woof in their direction. They didn't know enough about bears to heed its warning, though, and really couldn't have done much about it, given their proximity to the bear. From about 6 yards away from Hiroshi, the brown bear's low build and massive musculature easily pushed its way through the brush in an eruption that panicked the hikers. Behind the bear, he could see the brush parting as another animal was fleeing. Hiroshi began yelling at the bear and took steps backward to put distance between himself and the bear. He knew that the paltry steps he was taking away from the bear were being quickly outpaced by the bear's leaps. This is where the record gets a little confusing. Sometimes when people experience a traumatic experience, they do things they do not remember later. One of the hikers states that Hiroshi turned and ran away from the bear, but he only remembers squatting down and placing his arms over his head to protect himself from the bear's claws and jaws. Given that Hiroshi was the closest of the hikers to the bear, he bore the brunt of its anger. In fact, he bore all the brunt. The brown bear was upon him before he could react. Every part of the man's body that was touched by the bear's claws was torn and gashed. Its claws acted like the blades of a giant blender against the man's skin. As Hiroshi's flesh was being ripped apart, the bear bit into his shoulder. It drove its teeth deep into the muscle and tissue surrounding his bones, causing deep cavity wounds and punctures. The bear didn't stop there, though. It switched its attack to biting his back as he crumpled to the ground under the weight of the bear's body. The gashes torn by the bear's huge canine teeth easily ripped through the skin of his back, and pain seared through his body. Hiroshi couldn't help but scream out in pain as his hiking companions looked on as their friend was tattered before their eyes. With Hiroshi flattened out on the ground, the brown bear turned its jaws toward his rear end. It clamped its teeth onto his buttocks and ripped open puncture wounds. Hiroshi was clearly no threat to this bear, but what it did next would make you think it considered him a potent enemy. As he lay on his stomach, the bear turned its jaws toward his head. It wasn't satisfied with injuring the man, as it had clearly done that. It took his head in its jaws and bit down as hard as it could. Its bottom canines ripped into the flesh as the base of his skull, while its top canines tore into the flesh along his hairline. As it closed its jaws, it tore his scalp back and away from his skull. Hiroshi was clearly incapacitated by every means, but this brown bear wasn't satisfied with that. It had to make sure this man would not endanger it ever again. As a final measure to end this very one-sided struggle, the bear opened its jaws wide. It clamped its canines across Hiroshi's face from cheekbone to cheekbone and bit down. His bones cracked and gave way under the bite pressure of the bear's jaws. Crushing his face was the last impartation of violence the bear completed on the man's body. After having his face crushed, Hiroshi lay still. It isn't indicated whether he was unconscious or playing dead, but at any rate the bear had decided he was no longer a danger to it. As it stood over Hiroshi's mangled body, it huffed and panted from the exertion. It stared at him, apparently waiting for any sign of life. As soon as it was satisfied that he was dead, the brown bear slowly walked back toward the direction it had come from and disappeared into the brush. Hiroshi's friends had fled into the bushes nearby. After his cries for help ceased, and they heard the bear leaving, they slowly emerged from their hiding places. They called to each other as they focused their efforts on saving Hiroshi's life. The hikers somehow got Hiroshi out to a location that allowed rescuers to reach him. He was transported to the hospital for life-saving surgery. He would undergo many operations to restructure his facial bones, close his numerous wounds, and clean his gashes. There is no record I could find that indicated the precise number of sutures or stitches the medical teams used to close his wounds, but with injuries like Hiroshi's, they would have to number in the hundreds. His treatment must have continued well past the point that his wounds healed. The reconstruction of his facial bones alone would require several operations and possibly necessitate bones from other parts of his body being transplanted into his face to aid in healing there. Searching the internet proved very difficult to find any further information on how Hiroshi fared following this attack. There isn't any information on what happened with the bears either. It is almost like any information about this attack has been expunged from the internet for some reason. Hiroshi's attack was utilized to help shape policy surrounding bear treatment and avoidance by authorities. In the Denali National Park Bear-Human Conflict Management Plan, more than a few pages were written based on information garnered from attacks like Hiroshi's. Given that the second animal he saw fled through the brush as the bear approached him, Hiroshi indicated that he thought there were 2 brown bears there when he was attacked. If his insights are accurate, then that animal was likely a cub of the bear that attacked him. An attack from a sow bear is usually labeled a defensive attack, and most of the time no action is taken against the bear. Given the bear didn't remain in the area, cover Hiroshi with duff, or guard his body, it was clearly not a predatory attack. As far as the evidence showed, it had not stalked the group and ambushed them. That excluded a predatory attack as well. That leaves the potential that the attack was exclusively defensive in nature. But it also begs the question of why was Hiroshi's attack so devastating? The bear had incapacitated him immediately, and he was not resisting or fighting with the bear. It seems to me that the injuries he suffered were egregious but unnecessary given his behavior. Analyzing the injuries imparted by the bear, note that there were none listed on Hiroshi's hands and arms, even though he used them to cover his head. This indicates that he wasn't reaching his arms toward the bear to ward its jaws away from him. If he had done that, the bear would have mangled his hands and arms in its attack. The fact that he squatted down seems to indicate that he wasn't sure if he should run or play dead. If he had curled into a ball on the ground instead of squatting, do you think it would have led to different injuries on his body? After reviewing the details of this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the other animal Hiroshi saw feeling the area was a cub? Did the potential presence of the cubs exacerbate the aggression of this attack? Would bear spray have changed the outcome of this attack? Could Hiroshi or his fellow hikers have utilized a firearm in a competent manner to defend him? What could the hikers have done differently to avoid such a close encounter with an angry brown bear? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Denali National Park headquarters. The geography in the parks features the world's highest mountain in relief. When assessing a mountain's relief, it is measured from the elevation at which it starts and all the way to the top. Denali Mountain, also known as Mount McKinley, measures 20,310 feet, with the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest, reaching 29,302 feet, but only about 15,000 feet in relief. Relief is the measurement of a mountain's height from its base to its peak, but the elevation is the maximum height of a mountain without regard to its base. The area surrounding Denali was formed into a national park and was established on February 26, 1917, as Mountain McKinley National Park. The headquarters of the park is located within the first mile of the George Parks Highway entrance and offers visitors restaurants, hotels, and gift shops. The mountains of this area are covered with alder and willow, but in the valleys, spruce, fir, and birch trees dominate the skyline.
Moose, caribou, and sheep roam the trails while they hide from black bears, wolves, and grizzly bears. In the early morning hours of June 4th, 1980, 21-year-old Dan Marin and two of his co-workers were making their way across the parking lot. They were employees of one of the hotels that housed visitors to the park and were used to the beauty and dangers the park presented. As the hotel workers walked along the road, they watched two huge moose trotting toward them. These moose were not moseying like normal. They had a sense of urgency in their steps and were continually looking over their own back trail as if something was following them. Now, brown bears are not known to hunt in packs or tolerate each other's presence for extended periods of time. They are usually known to hunt and exist in solitude, except when the salmon run. During this time, the riverbanks are crowded by giant bears, pacified by bellies full of salmon roe and skin. They tolerate each other during this time due to an abundance of food, and this is not the typical condition for their existence. As the workers watched the nervous moose galloping across the road, they noticed that two huge grizzlies emerged from the same location on the roadside from which the moose had come. One of the bears was larger than the other, but they were clearly both grown and mature. Dan and his co-workers knew that the presence of the bears presented a substantial risk to their safety. Most of the time, grizzlies around the park would have little to do with humans, especially when there was more than one person in the group. The tension in the air was high, but the people did expect the bears to offer very little more than a passing interest in them as they loped across the road. Dan and the others stopped walking as soon as they had seen the bears following the moose. They knew that drawing the bears' attention could create a precarious situation, so they froze in their tracks. To their horror, the larger grizzly craned his neck toward the small crowd of people and immediately veered his loping stride toward them. The bears were only about 100 yards away when they initially emerged from the roadside brush, but the larger one quickly closed that distance. The workers grew increasingly nervous as the bear focused its eyes on them while it bounced effortlessly toward them. They undoubtedly hoped the bear would peel off and return to chasing the moose after investigating what they were. But the bear wasn't planning on chasing the moose anymore once it determined that there was easier prey nearby. Like a covey of quail exploding from brush, the hotel workers scattered in panic once the bear got within 20 yards. Dan ran toward the trees while the other two ran in other directions. He reached up and pulled himself into the tree, hoping to get high enough to discourage the grizzly from pursuing him any further. At this time, most people believed that grizzly bears could not effectively climb trees, and seeking shelter there was the best strategy. For the most part, grizzlies do not invest their energy in pursuing people who climb trees. But if the tree has low limbs that allow the bears to climb up, sort of what people would need to climb a tree, then they can climb up and pursue people. As Dan hurriedly pulled himself higher into the tree, the grizzly quickly approached the base of the tree. Now, the average grown grizzly bear stands at around 7 feet tall on its hind legs and can reach another couple of feet higher after extending its front paws. This means that anyone trying to escape a grizzly must get the lowest portion of their body at least 10 feet into the tree to avoid its reach. Dan almost got there, but not quite. As soon as the bear reached the base of Dan's tree, it stood to its hind legs and stretched its powerful jaws toward his lagging left foot. In another second or so, Dan would have been able to pull his foot out of reach of the bear, but before he could do that, the bear latched onto his ankle. The pressure exerted by the bear's jaws drove its huge canines into the bones of Dan's ankle, causing excruciating pain. Once the bear had clamped onto Dan's ankle, it used its mass to prevent him from climbing any higher into the tree. A bizarre tug of war broke out momentarily as Dan fought for his life. This struggle didn't last very long, as the bear used its weight to overwhelm Dan's grip on the tree trunk. In one powerful jerk on his ankle, the bear sent Dan plummeting back to the base of the tree. As soon as he hit the ground, Dan knew he had to protect himself or escape. This bear had run right up to his small group, then pursued him into the tree and even pulled him from its heights. It was clearly not going to be satisfied with pulling him from the tree. Dan scrambled to his feet and was filled with terror, being only a few feet from the massive bear. For an unknown reason, the brown bear ran a short distance away and glanced around. It almost seemed like the bear was trying to find the other people who had fled its jaws. Perhaps it was looking for the moose it was previously pursuing. Either way, Dan wasn't waiting around to find out which option the bear was most interested in. He immediately began to pull himself back up into the same tree. It was only a few seconds between Dan's abrupt landing to the point that he climbed back into the tree. It was possible that the bear considered him as food and was searching for another victim as it glanced around. After looking for anyone else around him, the bear turned his attention back toward Dan. This time, the man had climbed as fast as he could to get away from the bear. He knew better than to wait for the bear any longer, and had to get himself higher into the tree, even if it meant the bear would climb up to get him. As soon as the bear redirected its attention to Dan, it returned to the base of the tree. Again, it stood to its hind legs and reached its jaws toward Dan's ankle. It also placed its paws against the tree, trying to reach him one more time. This time, Dan had managed to get just out of range of the bear's jaws and claws just before it could bite him again. He watched as the bear was just a few inches from reaching him. It repeatedly tried to get its jaws onto his foot again and tried to pull itself higher into the tree. After trying for a short time, the bear reluctantly gave up on his pursuit of Dan and redirected its predatory urges back to the moose. After he was sure the bears had left, Dan and the other hotel workers yelled to locate one another. They nervously emerged from their hiding places and regrouped to return to the hotel. Dan had suffered puncture wounds in his left ankle from the giant bear's canines. As it tugged him from the tree, the pressure of the bear's jaws had bruised and stretched his tissues around the wounds it inflicted. He was taken to the nearby medical center, and his wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Dan was able to make a complete recovery from the injuries inflicted during the bear attack. There was no source I could find indicating that the grizzlies were pursued or killed by authorities. The attack happened so quickly, and the bears immediately fled the area in pursuit of the moose. No further action was reportedly taken against the bears. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I have a few questions for you. Even though the bear didn't actually climb the tree, do you think climbing a tree is a safe way to escape a grizzly bear attack? Why didn't the bear kill or maul Dan worse than it did? Do you think the two grizzly bears were cooperating while they pursued the moose? Would the scenario of massive grizzly bears forming hunting packs keep you awake at night? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.